Hello and welcome to an episode of On the Margin with me, Alex Kidwell, and my co-host, Boa Sobrado. Joining us today is Archie Burgess. Archie is an investment director at Cibus Capital, which invests in transformative technology, especially in sustainable agriculture. So if you've ever wondered how your food gets onto your plate and all the ways it's changed and going to change, then this is the conversation for you. We'll discuss some of the macro trends changing agriculture, like the changes to environment, climate change, regulations, and our different ways of living. And then we'll delve into some of the innovations on the ground, like drones, robots, soil detection, vision systems, AI, and work out what's actually real opportunities and what's just hype. And Archie, you can tell us a little bit about how he goes about investing in this space. So Archie, it's great to have you on the show. Welcome along.
Thanks for having me and great to be here. Thank you.
So let's start off with some context. So why is now a really big moment for sustainable agriculture, and where do you and Cibus fit into shaping the future of that?
Yeah, so when I started out and I joined Cibus about 5 years ago, it was a super niche sector. We were told we were being extremely niche, focusing on food and agriculture. Now there's been a huge transition. We're being told often we're covering too many subsectors. I think in the mainstream, there's a huge shift in focus to this space. Partly that's through the rise of things like the GLP-1 drugs, COVID effects, just food supply shortages over Russia, Ukraine. So there's a lot of recent events which have triggered a massive adoption of, or just, certainly on the mainstream media side, a significant focus to the sector. You're probably familiar with some other podcasts, the Huberman and Longevity, etc. That sort of shift in the consumer focus and the mindset has really kind of driven some of the discussion around these topics. And part of that is just exactly what goes into the food value chain. Clearly, it's not just the consumer and the brands and the end products, but it really starts on the farm. And just to give you an idea in the scale of the problem and why now is like super interesting time to be in the space. At the same time, mankind has to produce 50% more food by 2050 than mankind's ever produced in the history of mankind, given the recent rise in the global population, etc. And that's at a time of resource limitation, climate change, soil degradation, etc. And so it's really about doing more with less. It's optimizing, it's using precision agriculture, the latest data, drones, AI, robotics for us to get there. And at the same time, there's huge agricultural policy in terms of the regulation, the shift between the focus between the US and Europe is completely different. To live in one country, in a country like the US, any of the European countries, just the quality of food, the quality of produce, the food supply chains, a very different story. So lots of problems to tackle, but lots of innovation to come.
You mentioned ahead of our call that humanity was in a somewhat similar situation before in the 1970s, and then yield increases suddenly began to pick up, and we became a lot more efficient at producing food. Can you give us a little bit of this historical context?
Yeah, so, more that we've become a little bit more efficient, which isn't, so I think compared to other sectors, I think it's quite embarrassing, to be honest. So yield increases across row crops, so the cereals, for example, which covers over 220 million acres of farmland in the US, have increased between 1% and 2% every year since the 1970s, which when you think about other industries, other sectors, that's really nothing. So I think, and the other point is that if you look at those, say, prices of other, the price of corn in 1974 is the same price as it was last year. And that's not inflation adjusted. So you've got a deflationary optimization through yield increases, but you've also got, when you compare that to other industries, it's just not that. It's not that impressive at all. It's not exactly sort of reducing at Moore's Law's rate, etc. Agriculture is it's quite nuanced. It's not just, there's lots of different sectors. The way that we like to think about it and the way that where we think the most change, the most innovations happening, and the most, to your point on kind of, just cost of food, quality of food, is if you split it down from the top down, you've got row crops and you've got specialty crops.
Mm-hmm.
So row crops are the cash crops that the John Deeres, the Bayers, the Syngentas of the world focus on. And that's your cereals, that's your corn, soy, barley, wheat, etc. The specialty crops are the ones, these are your high value crops. fruits, nuts, berries. Some of them can be permanent crops. And in your specialty crops, it has 90% of the labor force. Row crops only have 10% of the labor force. So the innovation is going to come, and the deflationary aspect is going to come from optimizing the labor force / replacing and reducing the labor force over time, and with lots of automation and robotic technologies. And that's where we say we see the area of opportunity, especially because we're not competing with those massive players as well who can kind of undercut pricing.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because in the last 12 months, we've seen a huge surge in wholesale prices of precisely some of these specialty crops, as you mentioned. So the price of coffee is hitting all-time highs, much like the price of cocoa, which, they're both terrible things in my opinion. Is perhaps what you mentioned earlier with regards to the fact that there's very little innovation in this sector related to the great price increases in these two commodities recently?
Well, it's partly the lack of innovation, but it's also just agriculture is agriculture, and there's extreme weather events. There's a lot of the areas of cocoa plantations, for example, have suffered from unbelievably bad weather events. And you've got these external forces that impact pricing around the world, and with some of these core commodity crops. So the other area that we're seeing, and I mentioned rose crops and specialty crops, but one of the areas that we're very focused on is controlled environment farming. So you don't have any of these external pressures. I mean, you obviously can't do this with, cocoa, for example. Not to sort of shift the topic too much, but there are other technologies to produce cocoa in a lab, for example, that are getting a lot of funding. Is all controlled environment. You don't have these externalities, and the externality risk in agriculture is just extremely high.
You mentioned, Archie, that there's a lot of change with regulations right now. I imagine there's never more so than a change in government administration in the US, and especially with a character like RFK Jr., who's not keen on some of the FDA regulations. Can you talk about that? How is that changing things in your industry, and also the differences between the US versus the rest of the world?
Yeah, so I'd say, I mean, this is a personal preference, but in terms of quality of food to live in Europe, the regulations are a lot higher, and they're a lot more strict on pesticide, herbicide use on farm, what can actually go into the all the chemicals, etc., on farm, whereas the US is much more lax. And just to give you an idea of this, the US last year sprayed 145,000 tons of pesticide that was banned that are banned in Europe. About 25% of all pesticide use in the US is banned in Europe, which is really saying something. I mean, these are pretty bad chemicals. It's saying quite a lot about the regulatory landscape in the US for Europe. And I don't know if you saw just before Christmas that Red 3 has just been banned, which is a synthetic color that's used, actually sadly targeted mainly at children's food. And that's been banned in cosmetics for 30 years. The US have finally banned it in food products, which is going into effect in a couple of years' time. But to just give you an idea, I mean, I think RFK is actually going to rip up the rule book a little bit and not cater to the big food companies as much. And it's going to be much more interesting and exciting to have someone like him, not cater towards these and start really banning some of these inputs as they should have been banned quite some time ago.
So tell us more about that Red 3 and how is it allowed in the US but not in Europe?
So Red 3 is a color. So it's used to. So if you actually think about, I never sort of did this exercise before, but if you go into a supermarket and you think of what color all food is, about 75% of all food is either anywhere between kind of red, orange, purple, but very little food is blue. And so the Red 3, there's been a lot of energy from some of these big color houses to focus on red, orange, purple colorants. And Red 3 is the color that's been used, for quite some time, not in cosmetics, as I mentioned. The colors, the synthetic colors are about 10 times cheaper than the natural alternatives. They're also 100% pure as a chemical process. You don't have problems with impurities in the processing. So it's used in lots of different cereals, that kind of stuff. typically focus on children. And yeah, I mean, it's long overdue a ban.
Okay, so what is the macro context here? Because there's quite a lot of things that you've mentioned so far. Regulation being one of them. I'm guessing the extreme weather events, as you mentioned, climate change, population growth. These are all very important factors. Can you give us a little bit of more of context here? What are the most important long-term drivers for this industry?
Yeah, so the big innovation that's going on at the moment is that everything's becoming smart on farm. So you're capturing a lot of data. So every machine, even up to 20 years, 15 years ago, wasn't smart. So you didn't have any data being fed back to a central operating system. You weren't able to. Even today, there's only startups, and they're not really that scaled, that are focused on optimizing fleet management of all your tractors, your labor force, the logistics behind it, the quality control systems. And, in some cases, you've obviously got cold storage logistics as well, which is extremely expensive. So the point is, the way I'd frame it is everything that you've mentioned, but the key unlock and the kind of next revolution is going to happen in precision agriculture. And which is doing more with less, which is optimizing every input for a better output, and using all the data that's now available on farm through all these different implements.
Tell me more about precision agriculture, because I actually did an internship right after university for a precision agriculture startup, and what they wanted to do is they put these sensors all over vineyards, and the theory was, and this was over a decade ago, the theory was that because you have these sensors all over the vineyard, then you can be very, very precise around when you actually have to spray with pesticides, when you don't have to do it. The machine theoretically would help you with all of these decisions and would help you be a lot more effective. Is that still more or less the vision? And if so, how come it hasn't taken off massively in the last decade?
Well, I was going to ask you that question from the startup that you work with. I'd say that's more or less. I mean, you can't improve what you can't track, what you don't track, and so a lot of it is just getting all the data from all these different pieces of equipment on farm, and it's really finding product market fit, and then a sales cycle that makes sense in agriculture. That is the massive bottleneck in agriculture compared to other industries. They've got harvest, so you've got a sales cycle that's very up and down. It's obviously seasonal, and do not sell anything to farm is generally the right principle. You have to sell through distribution partners, and so finding that product market fit is one thing which a lot of startups struggled with. Because they captured all the data, but they weren't providing agronomic insights, actual ROI to the farmer. You've got to remember that a lot of these people, these are razor thin margins. They're on subsidies. They're on relatively small farms. They're not particularly innovative. A lot of it is very archaic.
Yes.
You've got to remember also that 65% of all transactions done on farm in the US are done with paper checks. These are still mailing in checks. There's no, digital payment system. It's extremely archaic. So finding that product market fit for that kind of customer is something that a lot of Silicon Valley come into farming and give that sort of pitch idea, but don't actually cater to the right customer and to the right customer profile, and then also get the distribution partners on board.
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties that the startup had was on the sales cycle. You're talking to people who are quite conservative in how they approach things, and for good reason, right? You tell a farmer who's got a vineyard that with this device you have to spend less money on pesticides, which they care a lot about, not just because of the environment, but because pesticides are not really cheap. But then, the potential upside for him is, I don't know, 25 to 33% reduction in pesticide costs. Potential downside is you lose all of your crop, right? So it's kind of a tough pitch to make to people whose livelihood this depends on.
Yeah, I think it's really unfair also to put all the onus on the farmer, given the margin profile I just mentioned, and then to tell them that they have to be more sustainable, they have to buy more expensive products and not use what they've been using for some time, which has worked. And, as you say, that risk is extremely high. So what we've found is, there's a lot of innovative solutions around this, and kind of how do you enable farmers to drive to more sustainable practices without impacting their bottom line, and hopefully improving it over time as some of the longer term benefits of these sustainable practices come into case. So, for example, if you do use sustainable products, your soil health is more likely, it's going to be better in 5 years' time, or 10 years' time. But farmers often can't see that far in the future. And the way that we've, one of the quite smart ways of doing it is through warranties. So you provide warranties to say, if you farm in a certain way and you pay for this warranty, we will guarantee your yield. And that way they move to more sustainable impact.
So how do these warranties work? Someone is taking the risk there. Who's financing this?
Well, so the risk, so the startup provides the warranty, but then that startup is backed by one of the bigger insurance companies, so like an AXA or GRI, etc. So you're providing that warranty through the retailer. As I said, you never sell anything to farm. So the retailers are then saying to the farmers, you can use these more sustainable products, and we'll bundle them, and we'll provide you a warranty to guarantee your yield up to a certain amount, which is a really smart way. Or they say reduce fertilizer use. Fertilizer is the biggest CO2 emission on farm. Reduce fertilizer use by 20% and use cover crops, and we'll guarantee your yield. Those kind of innovative solutions, I think, are really going to accelerate the adoption.
One of the advantages of agriculture is that everyone eats. So as long as you've got people, there will be a product to sell. There will be a market for it. However, one of the disadvantages is that because everyone eats, everyone's got opinions on food and technology. What do you think some of the biggest misconceptions around technology in agriculture?
Well, not just people have opinions, governments obviously also have opinions, and it's probably one of the most heavily involved government industries in terms of subsidies across the aisle in the US. What people get wrong about technologies in farming, well, I guess, you start with the seeds, and the amount of technology that goes into one seed in one crop is billions of dollars. And then it's, portrayed onto many millions of acres. Anything from genetics to all the latest biologicals to replace the synthetic chemicals on farm, all the way through to the robotics and automation that's happening and taking place now. I think there's just a lot more innovation than probably people, and certainly consumers think when they're just going to the same supermarket they went to for the last 10 years.
Do you think most people still imagine a farmer with his hoe and tilling the soil individually with a few farm hands? Is that the general perception that when you meet your friends and you try to explain what you do, is that their starting point? But actually, the world's moved on since then.
Yeah, I think that is their starting point. I mean, even if they've kind of thought about it, to be honest, a lot of people, as I said, it's only relatively recently that actually people have started thinking about, okay, how is my food produced? Where's it come from? There's also a lot of mainstream media articles about the sort of sci-fi farm of the future, which I think is like complete nonsense. I think there is, the way we look at it is kind of direct replacement of labor via kind of augmentation and just helping them. And all these solutions that are helping today's labor force, I think, have got product market fit, and they're kind of, these startups are scaling super quick. The one thing that people really, maybe going back to the sort of farming misconceptions, is, say, pickers, for example. One of our farms ships in 1,100 pickers to pick all the fruit, and they are extremely capable. It's difficult to replace this kind of workforce when you're looking at all these kind of new robots that are trying to be pickers. The speed and the KPIs of a picker is extremely impressive.
So is it actually really hard to get a robot to go around and pick asparagus from the ground, but it's actually easier for the time being to get someone from maybe a foreign country and pay them less and do that job of a robot for the time being?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's not close at the moment. So that's where we've kind of view the direct replacement of labour is not going to happen for quite some time. But to have every picker to say use a different trolley, or like how do they? At the moment, they use an electric wheelbarrow to go from picker to packer. Whereas why can't they just use a robot that then is all collecting all data on every single vineyard it sees? It's optimizing, it's telling the farmer what yield it's getting. It's doing agronomic insights of kind of fungal disease on vineyard, all in real time, and all like not kind of, these are all kind of ancillary services to just acting as an electric wheelbarrow without having someone to move 200 meters back and forth.
I was in Costa Rica in November and I spent some time in the coffee growing region, and I was astounded at how capable the pickers were. There's people from Native American communities in Panama that go over to Costa Rica to pick coffee, and they do this for a living across the region. And I forget the exact numbers, but basically they can pick 5 to 6 times more than the average trained person that has been doing it for a couple of days. Obviously, a lot more than I could. And the hills on which they have to do this are so steep that, frankly, I don't really see any sort of device managing to automate that away. I mean, if anything, I don't fully understand how they manage to go up and down those very, very steep hills. I assume there's a lot of other industries like this where it's a very much a similar situation, whereby this probably won't be solved for a good amount of time.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with you. Yeah, these pickers are super fast, and I think where some of the areas that it will happen is, say, mushrooms. So I don't know if you know how mushrooms are harvested, but they're in sort of controlled environments in these beds. And mushrooms double in size every 24 hours. So you pick them after about, well, it depends on what type of mushroom. So most of the mushrooms that you see in the supermarket are actually from the same family. About 90% of them are agaricus mushrooms. So you kind of wait to pick them at certain times. But obviously, pickers have working hours. A robot can work 24 hours, and you don't have like really hard dexterity of like, moving down a vine and having an autonomous solution. This kind of robot just works in this controlled environment and just picks exactly when the mushroom needs to be picked. And 50% of the cost of a mushroom is labor. So like that's going to be massively deflationary to the cost of a mushroom, for example.
What about in terms of like the actual picking on a hill is a hard problem. But what about, have you seen much in terms of cargo drones for getting the thing that has already been picked off the mountain, off the hard to access place, and somewhere where it can be processed?
I'd say a lot of the processing facilities, a lot of it's actually quite nearby. We haven't seen anything kind of when it comes to sort of cargo drones type. I'd say most of the innovation is happening in the upstream and the automation around making that picking workforce as efficient as possible.
Archie, I was wondering about the hype in this space, because I was kind of shocked as I was doing some reading before this call how many buzzwords there are in agriculture. There's all the AI buzzwords that you get, and then there's like the vertical farming, there's the soil detection, there's like humidity detection, so many different things going on. And then throw into that all the other things which are happening like climate change. But sticking on the technology topic, which are the biggest overhyped technologies in your mind, and which are the ones you think actually this is game changing?
Yeah, I agree with you. There's too many buzzwords. It's normally a red flag as well. So the way we look at it, I'd say maybe I'll start with the bad news first. The vertical farming space and insect protein production, you've probably read a lot in mainstream media about how these new vertical farms, so indoor farms, controlled light, controlled environment, controlled humidity, temperature, everything, is going to completely disrupt agriculture. That's not our view at all. I'd say I always think that people should really go around and look at a Dutch greenhouse and see how efficient it is. There's almost no people in these greenhouses. You've got a free light source instead of using controlled lights where your cost of energy is extremely high. And just the capital intensity of these businesses I think it's really difficult. And also, you're selling, you're selling basically a lettuce or a salad, which is the price point just doesn't work out. So I think there's a room for that, and the room for that is kind of things like microgreens, which have 40 times the nutrient density of a typical green leaf or salad leaf or whatever, but also at the same time a much higher price point. So that kind of thing makes sense. So small use cases, yes. Most of the time, we're pretty cynical of vertical farming. Insect protein production, I think, is really difficult as well. Novel livestock production is really hard. Like you've got to harvest basically a new animal in a source that's not been done before. You've got a huge scale up risk. The capital intensity is really high. You've got events that and mortality rates of somebody forgetting to switch the HVAC system and suddenly all your produce are gone. I don't know if you've seen recirculated aquaculture systems. So this is land-based farming, fish farming. So another type of livestock production, which means that you don't have any problems with the waterways and the oceans because of feeding these and basically drugging all these fish with loads of antibiotics. So you do it on farm instead, on land-based instead, and they're having the same problem. So they have very high mortality rates because it's a completely new method of farming something that's really difficult to farm.
I read that Jeff Bezos and some other guys invested over £300 million in vertical farming. Is that before like the Russia-Ukraine war when electricity was maybe a bit cheaper? Like what did they see that you're seeing differently?
I don't know when that was. And there's a few still of the vertical farming companies still going. And I think in general, most of them have pivoted to high value produce.
Yeah. By high value produce, do you mean the electricity is going to cost me £1 to run this thing? So I can't sell a lettuce, which I sell 50p. I need to sell an avocado, which I sell for £2. Is that
correct?
That kind of thinking?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
But also the other sad problem with the UK v the US is a cost of energy. So we're talking about like 10 cents a kilowatt hour in the US, maybe less. In the UK, it's like 45 cents a kilowatt hour. One area I think that's really accelerating fast is in the area of sort of precision spraying. You're using your sprayer more than any other implement on farm. And instead of just broadcasting all these quite nasty chemicals on farm, what these companies are doing is behind a tractor, they've got a smart implement. So they've got a smart sprayer. So they're using AI and detecting and spraying that weed in real time. So they only spray the weed. So you're reducing your inputs by about 95%. So you're only spraying 5% of the chemicals you would otherwise spray, which is a massive advantage. But you've also got a massive yield uplift because you're not spraying the crop anymore. Because these sprays were detrimental to the growth of the crop.
Is this where you think drones can also play a role in terms of as spotters, maybe? Because you can get like a very good perspective from above.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So yes, as spotters potentially, as precision sprayers, probably not, because the technology is just the way that the system works with ground-based solutions is much more accurate. But having said that, there are some companies that are using drones to do all the analysis. And then that data is then automatically fed into your sprayer. So then the sprayer does the variable rate spraying on behalf of what the drone's just seen, basically, 2 days in advance.
I was reading about a technology that kind of cut out the need for sprays altogether. So if I understand correctly, the reason why sprays exist is to get rid of weeds. And there was this robot which was going around, and because of the vision system that it had, it was able to effectively identify weeds. And then it would kind of zap it. I'm sure you've got a more technical term for it. And it would kill the weed straight away. And then slowly but surely the weed would just decompose. Do you think then that the opportunity where you're doing precision spraying is actually maybe like a temporary solution, and then the long-term solution is just get rid of the sprays altogether and let's find robots that actually root out the problem, pardon the pun?
It's a great question. We think about this quite a lot. I would say precision spraying is actually going to be the middle and the end game. And the lasers, which is what you just mentioned, where you are just zapping the weeds and you can use it on an organic market and there's no sprays at all, I think are great, but it's just a much smaller market. Lasers that you probably saw, that the cost of that solution is about $1.5 million. it goes at 1 kilometer an hour, it might replace quite a big workforce, especially in organic. But the market size is pretty small for that stuff. I think what's really exciting about the sprays is if you think about what the disruption's happening, one is 95% reduction in chemicals and yield uplift. Number two is replacing these chemicals with biologicals, or in fact just using stuff like hot water instead of some of these sprays. So you can also use it in the organic market, or you will be able to probably quite soon use it on the organic markets. And then number three is, well, in a similar way to the lasers, you'll have all the data of understanding exactly where all your weeds are in the farm, acre by acre, inch by inch, and understanding. And that data is basically extremely valuable to not just the grower, but also the big ag companies for the latest genetics, etc., for the crops going forwards. So kind of reduce, replace, regenerate is kind of how we think of it.
One of the interesting things you mentioned earlier is this dynamic of, well, it's a $1.5 million machine, and who can afford that? I think one of the difficult parts here is that I assume that most of the food that is produced by agriculture is produced by large-scale semi-industrial farms. But most of the people that work in agriculture probably work in much smaller, less sophisticated sort of ventures. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic and how that can impact sustainability?
Yeah, so you do have the sad case in agriculture is you've got massive players and you don't have a huge competitive market. It's not like cars in general, where it's a race to the bottom, frankly. If you think about gas vehicles. In agriculture, you've got massive corporates, and their R&D budgets have dramatically shrunk over time. And what they're using instead is they're basically investing into startups as a way of outsourcing R&D. And the point here is that when you're thinking of, it's the same thing in in farming in terms of the farmers themselves. Most of it's industrial, and then you've got these smallhold farmers, and the question is, how can you drive sustainability, across when you've got completely different monetary outcomes for these farms? So yeah, there are massive, especially on the specialty crop side. They're making quite a lot of money, these big farms, and there's consolidation game going on, especially when you've got generational problems in terms of as succession planning, etc. And the scale game, the economics just work a lot better in farming in particular. So there is consolidation certainly happening and across the Western world in this. I'd say most of just the nature of the industry and the nature of the capitalism, most of the innovation is focused on these big farmers because for obvious reasons, they can roll out quicker, they can try new technologies, and most of the industry is kind of catered towards the bigger farmers.
How do the smaller farmers operate? Because, you mentioned the margins are thin. They have a lot of capital costs. The crop yields and crop prices can be highly volatile. How do they manage to get by? It seems like a very, very difficult market to play in.
I mean, I completely agree. It's they've got challenges all around them, and they're also at serious risk of they're just a single price commodity risk as well. A lot of these farmers are only farming one or two crops, and they've got commodity price decreases, increases, inventory, working capital management. It's all very, very difficult and complex. Yeah, that I don't really have an answer.
Fair enough. The other thing I wanted to bring up that you mentioned was energy costs. And energy costs seem to be a great part of the equation of agriculture. Give us a sense of how important energy costs are and how they influence actual behavior on the farm and what the incentives are for agriculture.
Yeah, so I'd say that's more focused on the controlled environment farming, production of, some of these specialty crops that I was mentioning before, so tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, those kind of products in a glass house. The cost of energy is extremely important, and those businesses have proven to be pretty darn successful. I think in the wider landscape of just outdoor agriculture, it's not necessarily a huge game on cost of energy. The three biggest problems they have on farm, the three biggest costs on farm, and number one is, well, labor, inputs, and then depending on the crop, sometimes it's like pollination, but I guess the third actually varies dramatically, but the two biggest are labor and the inputs and your machinery, but that slightly depends. So I'd say it's really the focus and the onus of, from farm managers down to investors and everyone else is focused on those kind of main problem items. I'd say, we mentioned labor before and kind of the split on row view specialty crops, but on the input side, the majority of CO2 emissions comes from fertilizer use. So there's a huge amount of innovation around novel fertilizers. The holy grail is for nitrogen fixing bacteria or for nitrogen fixing crops, which basically mean they can feed themselves. And there's a lot of innovation and hundreds of millions have been focused on that space. But what we're looking at is, a lot of innovation around nitrogen fixing bacteria and just kind of other innovative solutions to reduce that fertilizer use.
One of the things you mentioned is that most agricultural producers don't have any pricing power. Why is that? Is it because the products are so commoditized that people don't really care and they just go for the cheapest one? Or is it for some other reason?
Yeah, well, commodity and also scale. There's multi-millions of acres, 100 million acres of corn in the US. Any farmer doesn't have access to scale and pricing power as a result. And there's also, globally, some of these crops, the amount of farmland focused towards, I think there's 550 million acres of focus towards animal feed, for example. So it's just purely a matter of scale, and everybody's just 0.01% of it, which means that there's no monopoly or pricing power from individual farmers themselves.
One of the other things you mentioned was the topic of subsidies. In Europe, farming is greatly subsidized. I think it's actually one of the biggest budget items of the EU, if not the biggest one. Why do we do this? Is it just a matter of food security, a matter of, well, we want to be able to get food if you can't buy it on the market?
Yeah, so it's a matter of both of those things. And also, so we want to reduce the amount of imports from a food security perspective, but also, if you just take a flight over the US, if you take a flight over kind of Midwest US and you take a flight over the UK, you realize why the UK farmer has very little chance of competing compared to somebody in the Midwest. The area of land, soil types, etc., but also just topography and the size and scale of these farms are just much smaller. So economies of scale don't work, and therefore you need some of these farmers to be subsidized and the ability to compete at a global scale.
I kind of understand that, but then farmers are also subsidized in the US, and they have a large market share already. I don't think the US is in danger of ever running out of food. What is the logic there?
Well, food inflation is something that everybody is very focused on. If you think of the typical person in the UK, that your post-tax salary, they're spending about 11% on food. That number's gone down from about 18% 25 years ago. But the ability for that to increase is pretty much non-existent. People are really focused on this. And I think it just goes down to general government principles, which is everybody needs to eat and everybody needs to afford to eat.
All right. One last question for me. You've made it clear why the government is subsidizing this and why it's important for food security reasons, because people should be able to afford food, etc. But does that make your job as someone who's interested in innovation in the sector more difficult in some way? Is there some sort of market distortion where people are less interested in innovation because their subsidies are paid out on a per acre basis or something like that? Does that happen?
Yeah, definitely. It's something we think about all the time, and also kind of how these subsidies are going to be tailored going forwards. In general, I'm not a fan of government intervention in markets, but I think there's certain ones that they should do in food and agriculture. And I think you have subsidies, some of them work quite well. And the way that we look at it is, we just kind of separate any subsidy framework and try and just see, what the economics of this particular company is. And regardless of how much capital outlay is going to come from the government via the farmer, it just has to make ROI sense. It has to make economic sense, before even thinking about the sort of added benefit of subsidies on top. Where it's there has been no innovation in, say, financial services in agriculture because nobody has touched it. Typically, agriculture accounts for like 1% to 2% of a bank's balance sheet or loan book. It's just not that interesting for some of these big banks. And there's a regulatory framework around Farmer Mac and basically the US government subsidizing all these rates. So no private sector participant has touched really that kind of market. There's no innovative digital solutions in financial services, as an example. And so, if that were to change, then we'd certainly, look at those kind of areas. But in general, we try and sort of separate the subsidy framework from our investment thesis.
So Archie, after all your experiences of understanding the industry inside out and many site visits, I'm sure, how has your day-to-day changed?
Yeah, so I get asked this quite a lot. I think number one would be to eat organic where I can, wash your fruit and veg. And for me, don't eat salmon, but that's a personal preference. I've been to a few salmon farms, but maybe I'll leave it at that.
Maybe that's the next episode. Thank you so much, Archie, for your time. It's been really fascinating. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.